Hey, Tolkien Poppers. This episode is sponsored by Theology Beer Camp 2026. And Theology Beer Camp is just an awesome place where philosophers, theologians, and various types of pop culture nerds have been meeting on a yearly basis. And it is an awesome event organized by Trip Fuller from Homebrewed Christianity. And if you have heard me on the podcast or been a part of the Tolkien Heads class or even seen some of my writing, you know that bringing together niche philosophy, theology, and Tolkien is part of my whole thing. And that will be present at Theology Beer Camp too. So there'll be links in the show note, but get your tickets for Theology Beer Camp 2026. It will be in Kansas City, Missouri on October 8th through October 10th. Hope to see you there. What up, Tolkien Poppers? It's Nick here with another episode of the podcast. And I get to sit down this time with Dr. Robert T. Talley Jr. of Texas State University and an overall Tolkien scholar who focuses on orcs. And we're actually going to sit down and talk about his book called The Mismeasure of Orcs, which is with McFarland. And so we get real nerdy about orc culture and the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit and even some of the other stuff like the history of Middle-earth. And we talk about the practical implications of analyzing orcs with sympathy and even maybe a little bit of empathy as well. And also accurately using Tolkien's words to do so. Who would have thought? Who would have thought? But this episode is super fun, and I think that you will enjoy it, especially if you like getting down and nerdy with Tolkien like that, and also if you like orcs. You know, who doesn't like orcs? If you listen to my episode with Mercury Natus, obviously we came to the conclusion that orcs are pretty metal. They're pretty punk rock as well. So yeah, it's a good time. So also, if you haven't seen, I have been posting chapters of a fantasy novel that I'm working on with the working title of The Broken Crescent. And so I've posted 3 chapters so far. They're always going to be free. But if you become a paid member, you can see world building documents, which I've also posted. You will get a signed copy of the book when it is published, and you'll get tagged on my Substack posts as a thank you, and you also get to be featured in the acknowledgments and the thank yous when the book is published as well. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, I'd love to just hear what you think about my writing. So without further ado, let's get into this conversation with Robert Talley about the mismeasure of orcs. What up, Tolkien Poppers? This is Nick here, and I've got an awesome episode today because we've got, a self-identified orc sympathizer. But before, we get into all that, our guest is Dr. Robert Talley, and Rob is a distinguished university professor of English at Texas State University, which is a new honor, he just told me, so that's pretty badass. He is an honorary professor of international studies there as well. His research interests include critical theory, history of criticism, 19th century literature, American lit, spatial, literary studies, and of course Tolkien studies, why we have him here. And we're going to talk about his recent book, called The Mismeasure of Orcs, which is published through McFarland. And so, Rob, thanks for coming on. It's good to see you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm honored to be here, and it's I'm a big fan, so
Oh, well, thanks.
it's great to be able to take part.
Yeah, feelings mutual, man. Feelings mutual. I feel like, Rob, I feel like I think we met through the Researching Tolkien Circle, I think, with Robin. I think so, right?
That's right.
Yeah, probably for the past couple years now. I think I heard one of your orc papers workshopped, I think even before your orc book was published, I think.
That's right. Yeah, you know, I don't know if you want me to dive right into my sort of how I got to Tolkien this way,
Yeah, sure,
or
go for it, man.
or not. I mean, I owe actually Robin a lot because she keeps putting together like panels at the Pop Culture Association or for other conferences, and yeah, she organizes her own regular study group, kind of informal study group. Um, and she was always encouraging me or accepting me for a panel, and the more I sort of became that orc guy, I had more ideas to say about orcs, and so I would appear on these things. But it began, and as you mentioned in your introduction, I mean, my background was not in Tolkien studies, and until very recently, I've still felt like, hey, I'm just an amateur. I wrote my dissertation on Moby Dick. I'm a Melville scholar. I teach Poe. I teach literary theory classes and classes on cultural studies or something. But Tolkien's just a fun thing I also do. And Robin reminded me, like, you can't publish 2 or 3 books on Tolkien and like 10 articles on Tolkien and then claim that you don't do Tolkien studies. Like you do Tolkien stuff. But it's interesting because the first article that I ever published on Tolkien at all, and again, at the time, I think I wrote it sort of for fun. In fact, I know I actually submitted it to slate.com.
Oh,
You
okay.
remember, I mean, they still exist, I guess, but, sort of a general cultural online magazine. And I sort of saw it as an almost, journalistic piece rather than a scholarly piece. Was the one that it's been reprinted now in the book called Representing Middle Earth that I published a collection of my essays on Tolkien in 2024, but it came out in 2010 in Myth Lore, the Tolkien and Fantasy Studies Journal, and it was titled somewhat tongue-in-cheekily, but also to honor the great work from the 30s. Let us now praise famous orcs. There was a book in the 30s called Let Us Now Praise Famous Men that was a study of working class people during the Depression and the poor people, especially in the South and Appalachia and places like that. And so the idea was I was sort of in the title kind of ironically honoring the lower classes of Middle Earth by saying, let us now praise famous orcs. And mostly that article was, hey, I know orcs are the bad guys, but even Tolkien showed some sympathy for them. And so that's how this started. Literally, my first ever venture into Tolkien studies was a piece on, hey, let's rethink the orcs. They're not, they're bad people, but they're not necessarily monsters. That sort of thing.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm very grateful because Slate turned it down. I think wasn't interested in it at all. I got sort of a perfunctory no without anybody analyzing the article. And then I put in a little more research and got my footnotes and did a little more research on it and turned it into a more academic article for Mythlore. And just a shout out to Mythlore. I know a lot of your fans will already know it, but it's a terrific scholarly journal, but also a really opening and welcoming community. They do a summer conference called MythCon, which this year's is coming up at the end of July, which I'm gonna be doing online, but it's also in person in Oklahoma this year. And the editor of Mythlore, Janet Brennan Croft, some of your fans and scholars will know, is the author of um, War in the World of J.R.R. Tolkien from 2004 or five, which had the really cool honor a few years ago of being featured as one of the books Stan is reading to learn more about Tolkien in South Park. I
Oh, yeah.
loved that. As soon as I saw it, I emailed Janet like, "You're famous. You're on South Park." It was so cool. But she is a wonderful Tolkien scholar in her own right, but also just such a supportive supporter of Tolkien studies and fantasy studies in general. So I do want to give a shout out to Mythlore. And another cool thing about Mythlore is all of their work is online for free. And they've got the archives, so you can even go back and read old essays if you want to see my version of Let Us Now Praise Famous Orcs from the first time. It's on there from 2010. But so orcs kind of got me into the world of Tolkien studies, as it were. And although I don't only write about orcs, I've written other things about Tolkien. I do I do now accept the position of being like that orc guy when it comes to several things I've now written. Now that the book's out, of course, I've
Right.
got a whole book on why we need to be more sympathetic to orcs in Tolkien's work.
Yeah.
So
Oh
that's what
man.
we're here to talk about. I'm sorry, I know I'm rambling on.
No, that's fantastic. I love it. And for people who don't know, Mythlore is the journal from the Mythopoeic Society. Like Rob said, it's free online. Awesome people there. Jana is amazing. Rob has work there. Lots of other people that have been on the podcast have work in there too, but famous people like Verlin Flieger, the Titans have published with Mythlore. So I would
Mhm.
encourage all of y'all to check it out. But before we get too
The
into, oh, go ahead.
Titans, and
Yeah,
also a lot of people like me, first timers. I just want to say, like, if you're thinking of writing something on Tolkien and you've never published before and you're feeling a little diffident about it because you don't know if you're at the level of Verlin Flieger, right? They still welcome a lot of new stuff. One of my former students, in fact, published her first thing in Mythlore, I think.
oh, really?
Yeah, yeah, and they're always looking for reviewers too. So
Yeah,
if you don't necessarily want to write a whole article, but you want to read a book and write a review of it, I'm sure that they would welcome that.
yeah. Tolkien Studies is one of the cool places where the gatekeepiness is at a minimum. People want you to participate. Yeah. So there's
Exactly. They're so welcoming.
yeah. I had a good experience too. I've always only had encouragement. Like you said, now my first article that I ever published was published next to Tom Shippey, and of course
Nice.
Tom Shippey's at the top, and my little tiny little first article was at the bottom, but I was like, I'm right next to Tom
That
Shippey.
it's very cool to share a table of contents with somebody you admire. I still get thrills when that happens for me too.
Yeah, dude. Yeah. Well, tell us too, because you obviously gave us your journey into the realm of orc studies, and kind of interest in that. But could you go maybe rewind a little bit before we go deeper into orcs about maybe your own just personal first encounter with Tolkien in general? Like, where did you first encounter him, and then like what got you into enjoying Tolkien over all these years?
Yeah, honestly, I don't. It started young because I remember vividly the Rankin Bass movie, The Hobbit, and reading The Hobbit. And to be honest, I can't recall whether I saw the movie and that made me want to run out and read the book, or if I had read the book around that time and then the movie came out. They definitely were close together, though. I don't remember which I did first, but that was in 1978. So I was 9 years old, I guess, at the time, which, technically, I guess, was Tolkien's target audience for The Hobbit originally, roughly, 9, 10-year-olds, I suppose. Um, so it was a good time for me to encounter it. I even bought the record. I don't know if you've seen that as part of the pop culture collections, but
Oh my gosh,
the
yes.
the album, the LP with the Greatest Adventure song, from the record. I had that in my youthful collection, so I immediately became a huge Hobbit fan, and that led me to Lord of the Rings pretty soon thereafter. I feel like I was too young to do it then, but I definitely read it before I got to high school. Because I remember in high school, I felt like I was old enough to tackle the Silmarillion, which
Dang.
which I then got really into in high school for a while. It's interesting though. I was never. I probably shouldn't say it this way, but I was never a huge fantasy fan exactly. Um, it's not. I know a lot of people who are into Tolkien are also into XYZ, and I remember there were a lot of things I didn't like. I mean, I'm of the age. I'm of the age, for example, when Star Wars came out in the summer of '77, that fall in the schoolyard, kids were bragging about like I've seen it 16 times. No, I saw it 19 times. And I'm like, I saw it once. It was okay. Like I didn't like Star Wars that much. And to be honest, I hope I don't alienate anybody. I still don't like Star Wars that much. I've come to appreciate its place in the culture. But at the time I'm like, yeah, it was pretty cool, I guess. There were other things I liked better. I suspect that there is a little bit of you know the whole fantasy versus sci-fi aspect, I suppose, where I dragons versus spaceships. I probably like dragons better.
Yeah.
I do know I remember liking Clash of the Titans, which came out like the year after, and of course is mythological and loosely based on Theseus, I guess. But the Tolkien was there. I mean, I really got into Tolkien for a while, not as much as some, but um, not necessarily fantasy per se, but Tolkien. And then, of course, I went on to college and grad school and kind of put all that stuff aside and was doing, serious stuff. I was a philosophy major and then grad school. But I remember in grad school, after I got to the people who went to PhD programs will know this term, but it's not a technical term, ABD. It's the stage of your dissertation research or your PhD program where you've done everything but the dissertation. So it's all but dissertation.
Mm, mm.
People will say, oh, he's ABD now, meaning that he's done all the coursework and all the other preparatory stuff. He just needs to finish the dissertation. Um, I think that term for people has become almost like a degree in itself because so many people do drop out at that stage. Like, yeah, I got to ABD and then I stopped. But I remember vividly, almost as a way of rewarding myself for finishing all the preliminary project stuff and knowing that I was about to write my dissertation on Melville. I, like that summer, reread The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, and I think even Silmarillion. I think I just sort of like, I haven't read this stuff since I was a kid. And so it really, enchanted me again. But as you know, rereading it as an adult is a different experience, and you pick up on things that you didn't before. One of the things I've been picking up even more now, rereading it for the umpteenth time, is just the syntax, the language. I'm reading it much more closely because I'm no longer reading for plot. I already know the plot, of course. So you start paying attention to the individual word choices, and it's like, wow, it's just blowing me away. I'm actually teaching a class on Tolkien this fall.
Oh, that's what's
So
up.
I'm rereading The Lord of the Rings right now for, again, the umpteenth time. And lucky me, I can call it work because I'm prepping for class.
Yeah.
What a good job that I can read Tolkien and call it work. But that's what I've been marveling at in this rereading. It's just like there are phrases I just want to stop and reread aloud to hear the just the 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 sounds of the rhetoric are just so cool, and the images. Anyhow, you know this, but I just would say, yeah, my Tolkien, my interest in Tolkien's work has been steady since I was 9 years old, I guess, but not constant. Like it sort of popped up here and there. And as I said, my first venture into trying to write something about Tolkien at all was 2009, I guess. Um, so even then, I I would have been 40 at that point, or 39 or 40 at that point. So I hadn't really thought about Tolkien as something I might have something to say about for others to hear. And it was the orc thing that, as I said, kind of inspired me. Actually, I
Yeah.
should mention another article, not to talk about my own work, but because you mentioned Shippey and Robin Reed and Janet Croft, they published a collection of essays called Tolkien, Author of the New Century, that were essays in honor of Tom Shippey. So it was kind of a festschrift for Shippey. Probably shouldn't call it a festschrift because that sounds like he's like old and retiring, but he's still working, of course. But celebrating his book Tolkien, the Author of a Century, and just his work in Tolkien studies over the years. And they had put out a call for papers, which I responded to and was fortunate enough to be accepted. So that was around the same time I was writing the Orc article, and I wrote something for that. It didn't come out until 2014 because it took a long time for the book to finally emerge, but I think I wrote it around 2010. And it was kind of a critique of the dismissal of Tolkien by Marxist critics.
Mm.
including my own former teacher and great beloved teacher, Frederick Jameson, who in his book on science fiction, and again, partly this aligns with that science fiction versus fantasy. Science fiction is considered progressive and technological. Fantasy is considered backwards looking and conservative. And in his one of his great book on Frederick Jameson's book called Archaeologies of the Future, which is on science fiction and utopia, he has a chapter called The Great Divide, where he talks about how we must not confuse what fantasy is doing with the cognitive estrangements of science fiction.
Wow.
Um, and again, this is a person I admire. I have a strong background in his own work. I've written a book on him. But and he was also a teacher of mine, and so I wanted to grapple with that. And part of what I was grappling with is it's kind of a false dichotomy. I was sort of saying, like, what you're calling, spaceships are good estrangements, but dragons are bad estrangements. And you may know the fantasist and theorist China Mieville, a
Mm-mm.
British novelist. China Mieville has written, I don't know, probably more than a dozen novels, and he's sometimes categorized as fantasy or sci-fi. Um, he was associated with what was being called the new weird, after a kind of Lovecraftian weird fiction. Definitely work that involves sort of fantastic elements. But he's also he was a socialist activist, and he's very left wing, and he's written a book on Marx's manifesto and on the October Revolution. He's a very active left wing voice, as well as a very active voice for fantasy and other forms of what I think he has called the literature of estrangement,
Mm.
a sort of broader category. But because he's a leftist who does this, he wrote a wonderful sort of defense of what, fantasy for Marxists, like why Marxists should also enjoy fantasy. And one of the things he says a little bit, uh, snarkily, I think, is that he says, you may think faster than light drives are more realistic than dragons, but physicists would tell you otherwise. And to a certain extent, that was my argument for that essay, was that the very things that some people, especially on the left, criticize Tolkien for, I mean, Tolkien's work for, are things that are of value for left wingers, and I've written other things along those lines, including my essay from a couple of years ago that was a critique of kind of the embrace of Tolkien by right wingers, and saying that leftists also need to not abandon Tolkien and abandon fantasy more generally to the right. Um, but that ended up being another thread through this, because obviously recognizing the humanity of even your enemies is something that I would hope that people on the left would be able to do,
Yeah,
right?
totally.
People who are nominally opposed to sort of racism and ethnic chauvinism and genocide and other things like this would presumably have some sympathy, at least, for orcs. Again, even if the characters within the books don't. And I probably should hasten to add, I am not claiming that Tolkien himself is in any way a leftist. Like, sometimes when you do a kind of leftist reading of Tolkien's works, they're like, but Tolkien was a conservative. We know that. He said that. He actively embraced that. And it's like, well, that's true. But so was Dostoevsky. So
Mm.
was Balzac. So was Sir Walter Scott. And that doesn't mean that left wing critics have not found in their work great value,
Right.
you know.
Yeah, it's one of those things that I feel like a lot of people, just in general, and this isn't even just a criticism, it's just a thing that I think is present, where it's really difficult for us as readers of anything that we enjoy not to project those values onto the author, especially when we read a passage from Lord of the Rings and we're like, man, this sounds a lot like revolutionary impulses, right? And they probably are there without also, like you said, claiming that Tolkien had, revolution and Marxist and socialist ideals at the front of his mind when writing stuff.
Well, and
But no,
we're so often, of course, in the real world of politics, like we have to go to the polls and pick between one side or the other, and we
right,
have to do that. But I think all of us, and Tolkien certainly was, more savvy than most, recognized the great complexities of everything. In fact, I think a lot of Tolkien's, even his political ideas, are probably not as conservative as a lot of people on the conservative side would
right.
wish, because he certainly embraces. I'm not saying he embraces things that the Labour Party of England were promoting or anything like that. Just many of the things that are written in his letters in his own voice, not just in his fiction, really provide messages that I think a lot of people, on the left would embrace.
Yeah, no doubt. I agree. And I think that'll be a good place to transition back to orcs because I think, you kind of take that sort of approach and apply it, at least in part, to reading the orcs in Tolkien's writings. And, orcs are obviously very popular in fantasy, circles, right? I remember playing Warcraft back in the day, and I always wanted to be the orcs because they were so
Yeah,
cool, right? The new book series Dungeon Crawler Carl, which is really popular. There, I the orcs are in there, but they're probably they're closer to goblins, I would say, but they're still, like you said, especially in Tolkien's world, the divide goblins and orcs is really, really marginal.
yeah,
But I think when traditional readers of Tolkien probably celebrate when orcs are killed, but I think more and more people, at least in this day and age, would be more likely to sympathize with orcs because they're such a big part of fantasy genre anything. And so I guess from that, like why, you gave us the reason why or reasons why why you like orcs and kind of have done work in orcs in Tolkien, but like why is reading orcs and doing this kind of work important for not just, um, you know, doing the work of interpreting orcs and kind of fostering a sympathy, but also understanding Tolkien and his legendarium in general.
yeah. I mean, it's interesting. Certainly, the image we now have of the orc, and in fact, even the word orc, a lot of people think Tolkien invented, although he expressly says he did not, and cites that, for example, the word appears in Beowulf, for example. So it's obviously a much older word. Um, Obviously, he's a Beowulf scholar, and so he knows a lot of these older terms that weren't in common parlance. He does make clear something that is confusing in Melville studies, Tolkien studies, that orcs and goblins are the same creatures. They're not even a hierarchy like goblins are a lesser version. They are the same, and in some cases he even says goblin is just a translation of the word used by certain people. He also had to make clear, and it's true in the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit, it can be a little tough, that even a term like Uruk-hai doesn't refer to a different race of orcs, or like when Aragorn, I think, makes reference to the great black orcs of Mordor, as if they're even better than the orcs you've seen so far. It may be that he's referring more to like better training, better skills. Like there's a scene in the Two Towers, the scene all of us orcologists would have to cite as one of the most important scenes for orcs, because it's called the Uruk-hai. It's the chapter 3 of Two Towers, where of the third chapter 3 of part 3 of Lord of the Rings. Called the Uruk-hai, where Merry and Pippin are being, taken to Isengard by the orcs who have captured them. And we learn very quickly that it's 3 different groups. One, a group of orcs from Isengard, led by a guy named Ugluk, Another group from Mordor, led by somebody named Grishnach, who is there to make sure that Sauron's interests are looked after. And a group that doesn't have any named character, but they claim to come from the mines to kill and to avenge their kin and then to go home. They have no interest in Sauron. They have no interest in the War of the Ring at all. They're there for their own personal cultural reasons. Presumably, they're a remnant of the orcs that we had already met in Moria, and they've been chasing after the group since then. But at any rate, they've all come together, and Ugluk becomes the one who leads them, claiming to be the fighting Uruk-hai, and the rest of these stink. But his description is less kind of racial than, again, I feel like almost like military rank. And it made me think of, like, you know, nothing against the common soldier. My dad was in the army, but just common soldier. But the Green Berets or the Navy SEALs or the people who have like really advanced training, um, because he actually says at one point, "What are they thinking of sending me these people who are untrained, or unskilled or something like that?" Where he's not saying they're a lesser form of being; they're just not good enough to be in my company. And they do tend to be smaller. Although that said, I mean it's like in athletics, like the bigger and stronger and faster people might have an advantage. That's not a racial advantage. It's just
Right.
that those people are. So all of this, goes to the idea of what orcs are in Tolkien's world, like in the fiction. But of course, orcs in the broader culture, Tolkien really, I do think, gets most of the credit. Obviously, goblins and stories of goblins, predate Tolkien, and his own interests in those stories are part of his own background. But when it comes to like video games, you mentioned, and I've already told you that I'm not as knowledgeable as I should be about the fantasy genre, but I'm absolutely ignorant of video games. I just haven't played any
Mm.
of them. Not since the Donkey Kong days, and I was no good at that. So um, I haven't played Warcraft. Can you be an orc in Warcraft?
Oh yeah.
Because I
So
know you
like,
can't in Dungeons and Dragons.
oh no, you can't. You can be an orc in Dungeons and Dragons now.
Oh, I
Um,
thought you could only be a half orc. One of my D&D friends says, "Well, you could be a half orc, but you can never be an orc."
I think
But
probably back in the
they've
day that
updated
was
it.
true. Yeah, I think
Okay.
the updates. There's another thing called another fantasy video game series called Elder Scrolls,
Okay.
and you can be an orc and customize, and there's a whole culture and everything like that too.
Very cool. Well, I'm glad, of course, more people discovering the cultures of these seemingly enemy creatures. Yeah. Um, I know when Gary Gygax, the creator of Dungeons and Dragons, died, there was a kind of again tongue in cheek thing about how he really set the stage for a kind of orc holocaust because he created a game where so many people level up by just killing orcs, and so it winds up just that the video games themselves require a constant stream of hit points, and so that's what orcs kind of become for the games that are kind of based on that, which inevitably if you're trying to win the game makes you think of these as cannon fodder.
Yeah.
Shippy actually says this. I quote him that as much as Tolkien clearly was concerned about the humanity of orcs and the way he treated orcs and whether or not orcs were redeemable, is the term he uses, and he says they must be because they existed and are therefore part of God's world, and God wanted them to exist, and therefore they can't possibly be utterly irredeemable. Much like sinners, can still be condemned, they can also be redeemed, and so Tolkien believed that. But at the same time, it would have required an amazing rewrite of all of his work to suddenly, treat the orcs differently. And that's when Shippy says, ultimately, you just needed a supply of enemies for the good guys to fight, right? Um, Another thing I point out in my book, though, that I think people may forget sometimes, and certainly people who've only watched the movies maybe underestimate, the orcs that we see fighting in The Lord of the Rings are almost always fighting with humans
Hmm.
on their side. I don't mean fighting against humans. I mean, they're fighting shoulder to shoulder with humans. The Battle of Helm's Deep is made up of orcs from Isengard as well as men from the Westfold and elsewhere. Um, the so-called wild men, the Dunlendings. In the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, of course, you have the Haradrim, you have the Easterlings, you have presumably the people who are coming up from Umbar on the Corsairs. All of these people are fighting in an army filled with orcs, and in that case, filled with trolls and Nazgul too. And they don't seem to mind that they're fighting with these creatures.
Yeah.
They're not running from them in fear. They're not assuming that these are monsters. These are just soldiers from a different battalion, but that are on our side. So Tolkien created a world in which humans get along just fine with orcs, just
Yeah.
not our hero humans, right? The bad guy humans. And even in The Hobbit, when they're still called goblins, when we first meet the goblins in the chapter called Overhill and Underhill, chapter 4 of The Hobbit, when we first see the goblins who have now captured the dwarves and Bilbo, and they're taking him to the Great Goblin, there's a line that says, these of course were goblins. They are, nasty and cruel, and there's the line about how they make many clever things but no beautiful ones, and we learn that they are actually very skilled craftsmen, very skilled tunnelers. They tunnel with the very best of the dwarves in their ability to do that. And then there's a line, and in some cases, wicked dwarves have made alliances with them. And so we see that even in The Hobbit, where if there was ever a book where we're on the side of the dwarves, it's The Hobbit, right? Because Bilbo is in the company of dwarves at that point. We learn that there are some dwarves that are happy to work with orcs.
Yeah.
So again, orcs aren't monsters, and they certainly aren't demons from hell that we, must avoid. They're just another people, and perhaps an uncouth people, people whose culture we don't like, and whose individual behaviors we don't like. But Tolkien makes clear, even in The Hobbit, and he makes even much more clear in Lord of the Rings, that they're people, and fundamentally sort of human or humane-like people. In one of his letters, he actually describes this, and I love the phrase. He says, "Orcs are there to represent various modes of badness." And various modes of badness is quite different from evil, right? Evil
Totally.
sounds like some grand metaphysical moral thing, but badness is also more pervasive because he means things like, being wasteful or being disrespectful of nature. So one of the things that the orcs are doing as they run along with the hobbits in the Uruk-hai chapter is they'll just reach out and like cut down flowers and stuff as they go, just for the hell of it. They're not really so much anti-flower as they're just destructive in general. There's again, I realize I'm rambling a bit, but in the famous potential sequel that was aborted after only the first chapter, called The Last Shadow. Again, I assume your listeners will know this, but Tolkien was asked to write a sequel to Lord of the Rings, and he started in the '60s to write one. It's in the History of Middle Earth series. You can find the actual thing that he wrote, which is one single chapter called The Return of the Shadow, I think, or
Yeah, I think that's right.
something like that. And it starts with an older man lecturing a younger man about orcish behavior. There's no evidence that orcs even exist anymore. But he says, "You're behaving like an orc." I think what the person had done was like picking apples from a tree to use as like, to throw at people. In other words, not to eat, not to value as fruit, but just to use as a plaything, but also therefore being wasteful. And that's what he describes as orcish behavior, not torturing people, not murdering people, but just like that's something an orc would do, picking apples not for food, but just to throw at people, right? And that's one of the things that I do feel Tolkien kind of had in mind, even in the early stages. Like if the elves represent a kind of over the top version of basic goodness and of a sort of sympathy with the natural world and a sympathy with the unseen world of the Valar and whatnot. Then orcs are kind of the opposite in that sense, but not because they are demons versus angels, but representing stuff that is within us all, the capability to behave orcishly or the capability to behave in a higher form. And to that end, whenever he uses orcs as a metaphor for actually existing humans, he's often referring to people who are not really awful, evil people. Like he's not referring to Hitler as an orc, and he hated Hitler, as is well known from his letters. But like his wartime letters to his son Christopher, who was stationed in South Africa with the Royal Air Force, Christopher was obviously complaining about how much he hated it. And in one famous letter, he says, "You are a hobbit amongst the Uruk-hai." So using the Uruk-hai as a metaphor. But again, he's not in war fighting Germans. He's in a tent surrounded by his fellow Englishmen.
Yeah.
The orcs are Englishmen there. And in another famous letter to his son, Tolkien says that. He says, I believe orcs are as real as anything in creation. And in fact, England has as many as anybody else does, right? I've met them. I've met them here in our green lands. And he talks especially about his experience being around orcish people when he was in the army in World War One,
Yeah.
which clearly at that point means, people who are not cultivated, people who are blasphemous, people who do not appreciate poetry and beauty, and again, the sort of crude people that we might all complain about, especially those of us in the case of a Tolkien or a Christopher Tolkien, sensitive young bookish men in the company of people who don't care about literature or poetry or whatnot. He must have felt like those people were a model for orcs. By the way, in saying all this, I'm not letting him entirely off the hook for another thing that we may wish to address, which is the obvious racial characterization of orcs in his writings, the use of phrases like swarthy and slant-eyed and sallow-skinned and whatnot that so many have pointed out is clearly a racial designation. But it's clear he imagines also that a lot of, white guys who look like me or who look like him could easily be orcs as well in our behavior and our attitude towards the world. And just a more humorous sort of footnote to that is he also tended to make reference to people as orcish just because they were part of this modern industrial world and seemed to embrace it. So famously, he would refer to people on motorcycles as orcs. He says, you never know what's going on under the helmet of an orc on a motorcycle. And specifically, he says that in a letter where he's talking about having gotten a fan letter from a person who works at a major industrial factory. And the very fact that the guy worked at a factory was enough for him to think that guy must be an orc. He knew nothing else about the guy who had written him other than that he
Right.
worked for a big industrial factory. And he, in a letter to his son, calls him an orc because of that. He also apparently famously talked about whenever he heard like a chainsaw. Oh, those are orcs because, cutting down a tree with an axe might be okay, but using a chainsaw,
Chainsaw.
that's
No.
orcish stuff. And so I could also mention though he's again criticizing his own like people, his own government for mistreating the enemy. He talks about in a letter in 1945 when it's clear Germans have basically lost the war and it's about to end. He says, they need to be defeated, but they certainly don't need to be dehumanized. And he said, he refers to the English sort of triumphalism at that point as he says something like the orc crowd hooting, we don't need to be like that. We can accept our victory and without trying to torment our enemies. Needless to say, that's something that works well in a quote for me, as I quote it in my chapter one, considering I'm writing a book about the defeat of armies that include many orcs by our good guys in the War of the Ring and Lord of the Rings. So.
You know, I even think when people talk about the nature of anything in Middle Earth, people do not engage the metaphysical or the ontological. And I think that is really, really important. And obviously, you emphasize that importance in exploring orcs because ontologically, they're not any different than elves or men, at least on a humane level. And so, you've already talked about Tolkien's sort of um, use as like a metaphor for badness. And then, of course, he
Mm-hmm.
wrestled with what orcs ontologically were. But maybe could you talk about sort of how Tolkien wrestled with the ontology of orcs, and then even how the neutral and negative stereotypes of orcs came up through that, and how that's kind of you've addressed it, and then of course other people are addressing it.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things is that Tolkien, in his very young days, when he's still sort of formulating a lot of these myths and sort of drawing upon the poetic and prose edos of the medieval legends and drawing from the Finnish Kalevala and these other writings that he's using to help formulate the way he wants to develop his mythology. Um, there are references to various kinds of creatures in those Northern European myths, including things like trolls. Famously, uh, people in Iceland, people in Norway will, to this day believe that trolls exist. It's very much part of the culture and whatnot. And so, I mean, I think his idea of orcs come kind of and goblins and things like that come out of that tradition. um, Again, it's a deep dive into Tolkien studies and Tolkien fandom to read these things that weren't published until after he died. But in the 20s, when he was writing the Father Christmas letters, which are charming, I don't know if you've seen them, but I mean, he literally just wrote
Oh
them for his
yeah.
kids. He never meant them to be published. But because he's such an imaginative writer, they got more and more involved and the stories got bigger. It started out as just like a letter from Father Christmas to the Tolkien children saying, like, here's what happened at the North Pole this year. I hope you guys have had a good year too. But each year he got more involved. And one of the years he created a creature called the Red Dwarf, dwarves, not orcs, that are clearly, I mean, again, kind of orc-like and need to be
Yeah.
defeated. And so the idea of having a kind of enemy for storytelling purposes and indeed in the mythology as well to be defeated, is part of that ontology of orcs to begin with. In his early writings, early versions of the Silmarillion, the stuff we get in like the Book of Lost Tales and other things that are in that 12-volume History of Middle Earth that Christopher Tolkien published long after Tolkien had died. These books start coming out in 1983 and came out right through the 90s. Um, there are earlier references to how the orcs were created. One is that Melkor, then called Melko, created them out of the subterranean heats and slime. And the notion that these could be almost like golem-like creatures fashioned from the earth itself, chthonic beings. Sorry, it's hard to pronounce the word chthonic, but creatures of the earth itself. This, by the way, would have solved a lot of problems because you're not worried about demonizing the enemies if they're not human, if they're just made of dirt or something like that. Um, Another version that I mentioned in again, I'm not assuming anybody's read my book, but the first chapter is on sort of Tolkien's ideas of orcs in general and draws heavily on his letters and other nonfiction. The next chapter is focused on the Silmarillion and the Silmarillion myths and the way in which orcs changed in his imagining. both before and after Lord of the Rings. So some of his early versions, he does see them as kind of demon-like creatures that are in the service of the great Morgoth, and then Morgoth's right hand man is Sauron, or even created by him. But he eventually comes to the idea that is accepted in Lord of the Rings and is more or less accepted in Tolkien fandom and studies, that because evil cannot create, it can only corrupt, and certainly cannot create new sentient beings. Only God can do that. Um, there's no way that the Satan character, the Diabolus that is Melkor or Sauron, could have created a new race of sentient beings. So Tolkien comes with the idea that they're elves, basically, that have been tortured, twisted, tortured. And this is more or less canon, as people use that term now, right? And so the idea, for example, in the Rings of Power TV show, we meet a character in season one named Adar, which we later learn is the language, in the language of the orcs, means father. And he's apparently, he looks a little, he looks rough, but he doesn't look like a monster. He looks like a sort of grayish, pale skinned elf, even with the elf's pointy ears, as they like to do in those shows. And we learn that he's one of the original orcs. And the reason the other orcs call him father is that he's been around since the original days when the first orcs were created out of elves. And there's really in that first season a touching scene of him right before the battle. And again, we're cheering against him in that battle, of course, right? He's going to be
Right.
battling against the good guys. But he does this ritual that a good elf also does, and says, this is what we do before a battle, planting seeds, new life in, because we anticipate death. And we see him doing the same thing. So like his elfishness is still there as an orc. That's one of the very rare things, by the way, about the Rings of Power I liked, was that Adar character,
Yeah.
who in the second season they turned into a sort of a boob and a monster. So they sort of blew it, but from my perspective. But it is to say that it's part of the even Tolkien uh, adaptation world that orcs come from elves. Um,
Yeah.
Tolkien uh, Tolkien then, after Lord of the Rings, and maybe I shouldn't jump to after. In The Hobbit and in Lord of the Rings, the orcs we meet, in The Hobbit we don't meet a lot of orcs, but we do meet the Great Goblin who speaks with Thorin. And we have the narrator telling us about the other goblins. We hear other goblins speaking. For example, one complains that they were on our front porch. And I realize that's an anachronism that Tolkien probably regretted, but the notion that they were taking shelter in a cave in the mountains that the orcs see as their front porch is itself a very homely way of imagining goblins as being human-like, right? They have porches. Not only do they forge weapons and build, machines, but they also have something they call a front porch. So there's a humanity to the goblins even in the Hobbit that is sort of assumed. They are a people. We don't like them. They're a bad people. They're a wicked people, but they're still people. And in Lord of the Rings, as I said, we actually get to meet more named orcs who express their fear, express their concerns. Ugluk says, the whiteskins will come and will kill you and eat you, which means that they've probably been fed the same anti-Rohan propaganda that the Rohan people have been fed about orcs, because we never see orcs actually eating people, and we certainly don't see
Right.
the men of Rohan actively eating orcs. But read in that way, and again, people who are anti-orc can be very literal when they hear an orc talk about eating humans, uh, but not at all literal when they hear other things. There is, by the way, okay, I'm footnoting myself here, but there's a reference in that chapter where one of the orcs claims that Saruman gave them man flesh to eat, and that's cited, and it was used, I think, in the movie as a line that Saruman himself utters.
You will taste
But
man flesh. Yeah.
yes, there, yeah, exactly. And of
Yeah.
course, you put it in the basso profundo that is, Christopher Lee's voice. It sounds even better, right? Uh, but in the book, as soon as one orc says this, the other orc who's fighting with him says, "Oh, I bet he gave you orc flesh to eat." In other words, even the orcs don't believe that, right? Even the
Mm.
orcs know that he's not giving you man flesh, right? And another thing that makes me think he's not giving you man flesh is that we later learn that in Isengard, again, the army isn't made up of orcs. The army is made up of orcs and men, as well as what Aragorn and Merry will call goblin men or half orcs, which suggests, and this is where I do get into racial ideas, right?
Mm.
Miscegenation or
Yeah.
the idea of mixed race. Needless to say, in the book, there's reference to breeding men and orcs, which makes it sound like it's an evil plan on the part of Saruman or Sauron to do this. Whereas if we already imagine orcs and humans as living together, working together, fighting together in the same army, why wouldn't we imagine them choosing to sleep together and possibly, having families together? Uh, to me, all this talk about some evil king or leader breeding orcs just again sounds like propaganda. It would be like people in the Soviet Union complaining that the baby boom in America is America breeding a whole generation to fight the communists. Like, no, it's just a
Right.
lot of people having sex and having babies. It's not a planned breeding process. But again, I can see the enemy worried about the growing population of their enemy, calling it breeding. They're breeding armies against us. But it doesn't, nothing we know about the way orcs reproduce. Tolkien himself insisted they reproduce like the children of Iluvatar reproduce, which is to say sexually. Um,
Which
uh,
there's a father and son relationship of orcs, right? In the
there's
Hobbit, right?
at least one named father-son relationship where we learn in The Hobbit that Bolg of the North, whose father Azog you slew in Moria, is upon you, right? And if Bolg can have a dad, that's why I wrote the the thing about orc women and called it Bolg's mother. We don't know who Bolg's mother is, but he must have one, right? And
Right.
anyhow, after the Lord of the Rings comes out, and we have all these characters who, again, they have names, but they also have languages. One of the things in the Uruk-hai chapter that I love is that we're told they have to speak the common tongue, and therefore Pippin and Merry can understand it because they themselves speak different languages. So right there, Tolkien being, of course, the great philologist and linguistically minded person, already wants to let his readers know he didn't need to do this, by the way. If you're just going to have a demon enemy for Aragorn to kill, you don't need to give them all this cultural background. But Tolkien being Tolkien, he couldn't help himself, right? So if they come from three different places, then of course they speak three different languages. They have three different sort of cultural traditions. Orcs are not homogenous, again, just mindless demons serving their evil masters. And later, of course, Tolkien. I already mentioned Tolkien commiserating with his son about how much he hated being in the army and how much he recognizes his son hates being in the military. Well, where do we get to see soldiers complaining about being in the military? The conversation in the final chapter of The Two Towers, called The Choices of Master Samwise, between Shagrat and Gorbag, one of whom is the captain from Minas Tirith, and one is a captain from the Tower of Cirith Ungol. And they're both complaining about their lousy jobs and how they don't trust their superiors and how they hope the war goes well because afterwards we'll never have to do this crap again. Like they sound very much like let's face it, like very common regular guys. Now, I'm
Oh
not saying
yeah.
they're not also bad guys. One guy kills the other later, so it's not like they're nice guys. But if you wanted to imagine what it's like to be, in the army in wartime, I imagine that for every valorous, shining arm of the mighty warrior in battle that we get with a guy like Aragorn, you're getting a lot of people
Even
grumbling about why are we even fighting these guys?
I even think
I
about
can't
office
wait for the war to be
politics.
over.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean
well,
I think about they're like, oh, I hope that boss gets a promotion so he leaves this department and I'll never have to deal with him ever again.
well, and that conversation is so telling because one of them is saying, the war's going well, I hear. And it's like, yeah, you would hear that because, he already doesn't trust the bosses. And then they use the phrase, Tolkien even capitalizes it. He says, they can make mistakes. Even the big bosses can. And of course, the big bosses refer to like the Witch King, the head of the Nazgul, or Sauron himself, and the idea that they don't trust their leaders. Well, again, I have no doubt that there are soldiers in World War II who don't trust German soldiers who don't trust Hitler, British soldiers who don't trust Churchill. Like, they're in the midst of a war that they didn't start, that they didn't want to be part of. They're just hoping that it ends well so that they don't get killed. And one of them even says that. He says, if the other side gets topside, we're done for. Like, we better
Right.
keep fighting because otherwise the enemy does not love us. In other words, they won't just defeat Sauron, they'll come after us too. Again, that seems to me a very human, very ordinary human kind of worry. And it is perhaps ironic that the most human and ordinary human kind of conversations might be found among the orcs. I'm certainly not suggesting you don't also get that with people like Sam and Merry and Pippin. I mean, they're ordinary people too. I think sometimes the elves, especially the high elves that we meet, Galadriel, Celeborn, Elrond, they're so preternaturally good and high and above us that they don't, we admire them, of course, but we don't see ourselves in them. I see a lot more Gorbag in me, and I hope a lot more Sam in me, and a lot more Merry and Pippin and Frodo in me, right? But still, those guys are much closer to me than Galadriel probably is. As a lore
Yeah.
master, maybe I should see a little bit of Elrond in me, but I'm just not that smart. He knows ancient dwarvish after all. My Latin is very rusty. But
We
so
can you can be a Bilbo.
I can, yeah, Bilbo. I could be a sort of, yeah, more of a bookish amateur than the greatest lore master of all time. Well, Elrond has an advantage because he remembers the whole Second Age. People who are 10,000 years old have an advantage
Right.
when it comes to history. But I'm sorry, I didn't finish my trajectory. I'll just very quickly say, after the Lord of the Rings and after his very humane depiction of orcs, he did start to worry about the way in which, again, the good guys are so ruthless towards orcs and whatnot. And so he tried to imagine, and this appears in the volume 10 of the History of Middle Earth series, the book called Morgoth's Ring. There's a whole section great for orc people if you want to get to it. It's like a 50-page section, 30-page section maybe, of him just sort of thinking through the ontology, as it were, of orcs, and maybe there are other ways. And he even uses the phrase, Christopher quotes this, thinking with the pen, which I love. The idea that he's not necessarily saying this is what I think, but I'm just going to write down some notes to sort of get an idea. And he tries to imagine what he calls alternative makings of the orcs, that maybe they aren't twisted from elves or humans, but maybe the dark powers created them in some other way. Because they're sentient beings, he couldn't imagine that dark powers could create them ex nihilo, because that would put them at the level of Eru Iluvatar, the one god. Even the Valar can't do that. By the way, there's a major scene in the Silmarillion to back this up that is also cited, and that's when Aule tried to create the dwarves, and all he could create were little puppets or dolls, because they couldn't be granted sentience and real life until Eru himself infuses them with the flame imperishable and whatnot. So that scene alone tells us that orcs can't possibly have just been created. They have to be God's creatures. They have to be creatures that God wanted to exist. And so then the question is, how were they corrupted and made into such evil things? How is it an abomination that God's creatures could become such monsters? And he tried to come up with alternative versions, none of which he even seemed to buy because they just seem so far-fetched. One is that they might have actually been automatons, like dolls, essentially robots, that when we hear them speaking, that's really more like tape recordings, like that was built into them when they were built. He actually uses the term tape recorder. That doesn't seem likely. It doesn't seem likely
Right.
that Morgoth would have created robots that could then complain about having to work for Morgoth. That's not the tape recording he would have put in them. Um, Similarly, he tries to come up with the idea that maybe they're just animals, like animals who can talk, because we've already met animals who can talk, like crows that speak and whatnot. And so they don't have souls, they don't have thea, as he calls them in his mythology. And so they could be like, their speech is more parrot-like. They're echoing the speech of others, but they can't come up with their own words. And he realizes that's not going to work, not without completely rewriting his previous books. One example that he doesn't give that I think is fascinating, because there is a medieval precedent for this in sort of the ancient Viking world of the Northern Europe. The idea that they could be reanimated corpses, or corpses who have been sort of possessed by demon spirits, kind of like a barrow wight, and we have a barrow wight,
Yeah.
right? Um, Apparently, there is reference to this in medieval lore, the idea that a fallen warrior could then become animated by a demonic spirit and then become. Now, this sounds to us, people our age, like zombie apocalypse. The orcs are actually zombies, right? They are dead beings that have been reanimated somehow and now need to be fought. I can understand why there might be theological reasons why he doesn't want orcs to be, as it were, reanimated corpses. But it's true that he would have known as well as anybody that the sort of ancient um, cultures of the North, who believed in like Odin and North mythology, did imagine that this sort of thing was possible, and that might have solved some of his problems. But ultimately, Christopher tells us ultimately he didn't like the idea that his highest creatures, the elves, could become orcs. So he says orcs are basically corrupted men. But I think ultimately what he had to believe, if he was really pressed, first of all, the first thing he would believe is, we're asking too many questions. It's just a story. Like, we don't need to take ourselves this seriously. And in one of his letters, he even put a note on it, like, written but not sent, because I thought I was taking myself too seriously.
Right.
So I think he realizes, like, hey, come on, it's just a story. Don't get too much into it. But the problem with that is Tolkien's the one who puts us in it. He's the one who wrote, 10,000 pages when he could have written 100, because he himself was so interested. So um, I think that if pressed, he would say, as I'm suggesting, that what they really are is just humans. They're humans who can mate with other humans. They're humans who, we can racialize them. There is that famous letter where he refers to them as having the appearance of the least lovely Mongol type. Actually, I should say least lovely to Europeans Mongol type. He even gives it a kind of relativism, recognizing that Europeans might think they're unlovely, but others might not. That seems to clearly racialize it. If you imagine what the orcs actually are Genghis Khan's Mongol hordes coming across the Russian steppes to invade Europe,
Right.
then it's straightforwardly racialized, right? And historical. He didn't want to go that far, and I don't either. I don't want to suggest that orcs are simply, um, Mongols, or even strictly speaking analogous to Mongols, but he does raise that issue, and the suggestion that the threat is coming out of the east, obviously leads to some of that as well. Um, ultimately, I think he felt that, orcs are humans. They are bad humans that maybe need to be defeated, but ultimately that they are just another kind of human, just as the Easterlings are, and the Haradrim are, and the Variags are. We meet lots of. We don't meet them personally, but we encounter in Lord of the Rings lots of humans that are bad guys. The Dunlendings,
Right.
you know. We're even told, in fact, if we dig deeply through the appendices, that the people of Bree, including people like Barlam and Butterbur, originally descended from people who had come up from Dunland. In other words, the Dunlendings and the Bree folk overlap. It's just that Bree is not a town of enemies, so we don't hate them as much as we hate the Dunlendings of the south of Isengard. Uh, but even, again, Tolkien is so good. Anybody, the anti-Tolkien people have always said things like, "Oh, he's too black and white. It's just a world of good versus evil." Nothing could be further from the truth, as you know from reading it.
Right.
He even has, during the Battle of Helm's Deep, he has a man of Rohan, um, Gamling, I think is his name, explaining to Eomer that what the people are chanting is actually an ancient language of this land, and that we're the ones who invaded it and drove them out. And he knows the old language. And so he's explaining to his own countryman, who is also, of course, one of his leaders, no, no, the people we're fighting against, we're the ones who kicked them out of here. They're mad at us for that. They weren't just incited by Saruman to go fight Rohan. They have an ancient grudge against Rohan that happened before Saruman even came to Middle Earth. And that ancient grudge is because you are the colonizers who took over their lands. Now, Tolkien
Yeah.
didn't need to add that. He could have just said, those are the bad guys, let's kill them. Instead,
Right.
he shows that the bad guys have their own legitimate grievance, and possibly one that is more legitimate than even Rohan.
I
And
mean,
then
you
he just
kind of
leaves it
also
there.
bring in, and you bring in the Druidine too, and even the Druidine are like almost an even closer, connection that have a closer connection to orcs.
Yeah, well, the Druidine section of again in the Return of the King in Lord of the Rings is fascinating because we learn, and again, this is after for several chapters we've been embracing the men of Rohan as our noble cousins that we love. We love Eowyn, we love Eomer, we love King Theoden and all of his nobility. Yes, they're not quite as noble as Aragorn or the elves, but still, they're good people that we're on their side. And then we learn in that chapter that the people of Rohan hunted the Druidane for sport. They're not cannibals, they're not eating them, right? But they would hunt them for sport. It's been suggested that the Druidine are based, well, there are lots of theories about influences, but some have suggested almost the several things looking like Native Americans, like
Mm-hmm.
red Indians, as Tolkien calls them in letters.
Right.
I don't think they're based on that directly, but certainly the notion that we can sympathize with a noble people that even our noble friends have hunted for sport. And of course, the happy ending with the Druidine is that um, at the end of the War of the Ring, King Elisar announces to them that the Druidane forest will belong to them forever, and we will never try to take you over. And it's basically this reservation belongs to you now, and we promise not to not to plunder it or kill you anymore. And that's the satisfying ending. But they're still, of course, dehumanized may not be the right term, but they're definitely seen as lesser humans. The
Yeah.
language, of course, is a little unfortunate um, as well. But yeah, the idea that here's yet another culture of humans that are considered lower on the hierarchy. Speaking of hierarchy, and this is something I know, for example, many people have written about. Michael Drought in his new book really spends a lot of time on the hierarchies within racial hierarchies, even within races, like the Banyar being higher than the Noldor, being higher than the Sindar in the elves. Faramir, again, one of the most beloved characters in the whole book, is the one who enunciates to Frodo the three races of men. We being the highest, the men of the light, the Numenorians. Notice how the people who tell us the racial divisions always seem to come from the top. You know,
Right.
like like the guy who divided the world into Caucasians and blacks and Mongolians happened to be Caucasian himself, didn't
Right.
he? But he then says, then there are the men of the twilight, such as men of Rohan, who are good people but not as good as us. And then there are the men of the darkness, which he says are the wild men. But you can imagine, again, if he saw orcs as human, they would be, I don't know, midnight or something, even darker darkness, to get them further down the list of the types of humans. But in that world, to have such hierarchies even within races then means that there's obviously the hierarchy of races, elves at the top, men next, and so on.
Right.
Definitely orcs are going to be at the bottom of that of that hierarchy. The question then is, even if you agreed with that as a hierarchy, do you still have the right to then just hunt them down and kill them?
Right.
Presumably, the lowest caste may have fewer rights, but the right to life might still be one of them. And within the world of Tolkien, that's clearly not true. As we were saying, they're not even captured for questioning, not even captured for legitimate military purposes. They're just killed outright. Now again, I'm going to make people mad at pointing this out, perhaps. Um, but as I said, almost every time we see the orcs in Lord of the Rings, this is not true in Moria, but it is true in Helm's Deep, and it is true in Mordor and in the Battle of Pelennor Fields. They're working alongside other humans, which means that the enemy that our good guys are fighting against includes orcs, but it also includes humans.
Yeah.
And I've seen reference, in fact, I've probably made reference to Legolas and Gimli's orc killing game, but it's not an orc killing game. You reread that chapter, you'll see it's an enemy killing game. They never specify that they're counting up orcs. They're counting up the people they have killed. That includes orcs. And one way I know that is that there's a scene where Gimli, because he's a little smaller than the humans and thinks that he might not, win the battle, sort of lays low while these humans are fighting, and then comes out and starts killing some orcs afterwards. But he's in that very scene talking about how I'm fighting both at the same time. And I
Right.
thought those guys were a little big, so I went for the smaller guy. But Legolas is shooting arrows. I'm assuming he's shooting Dunlendings with arrows as well, because the enemies are the enemies. And so it does sort of, as the kids say, hit differently when you imagine our heroes are killing their fellow human beings and not just demons. You know?
Yeah. Oh man. But like you said, the orcs are human, or at least humane beings, right? And I think that's like one of the things that I loved the most about your book, is that of course we get into the nerdy details, the exploration of how Tolkien wrestled with them, and even unpacking the orc cultures that exist in the writings. But I mean, your emphasis on analyzing orcs as such like allows us as readers to foster a more holistic and empathetic approach to ourselves and humanity in general, right? Those racial hierarchies exist in the real world, the sense of like, as far as how they're culturally constructed in different ways. And of course, we know that there's no scientific basis, right? That's where racism comes in. And of course, this exists in Middle Earth as well. But like, how does giving orcs and other villains a fair shot like bring about empathy and our ability to critique those sort of racial hierarchies and those inhumane hierarchies? And then do you think that Tolkien came to this sort of realization as well as towards the end?
Yeah, I really do. I mean, I don't know about, in terms of like at the end he was more pro-orc. If anything, I think
Sure.
maybe that's why he was trying to come up with ways to make the orcs more properly evil beings that we are allowed to kill, because that would make more sense for his stories. But Tolkien, of course, experienced in very vividly and personally World War One, and again, almost all of his schoolmates, I think all but one of his closest friends, died in the war. And
Mm,
in Tolkien's own case, he survived the war in part because he got trench fever. He lucked out by getting too sick to fight, and so he ended the war in hospitals. Nobody would wish to be in the hospital, but that probably saved his life. And so he recognizes, the whole war is hell thing. Again, anti-Tolkien people, especially some on the left that I know, have criticized Tolkien for glorifying war, for creating, these glorious warrior heroes like Aragorn or Glorfindel or all the great figures, and therefore making warfare seem like a good thing that young men would find as stirring adventure stories. I don't think that's true. Again, close reading shows just how much even Aragorn doesn't really want to fight. He feels the need to fight, right? And Faramir has the wonderful line that everybody loves about how, I don't admire the sword for its point, but for, what it protects or whatever, right?
right.
He's willing to do his duty as a soldier, but he doesn't enjoy killing, supposedly. Um, and I think Tolkien couldn't quite be a pacifist in that sense. He felt that there were times that fighting was necessary, but I think he was quite clear that defeating the enemy army is not the same thing as, again, demonizing the enemy. Partly because obviously World War One and World War Two, especially from England's perspective and from the perspective of someone in England, was a war against Germany. Now also Italy and Japan, and but you're feeling it. The Blitz is the German bombers, right? Um, and Tolkien is Germanic. I mean, his own background is Germanic, but also his interest in early English language comes out of the Germanic tradition. His interest in Northern European mythologies overlap with Germany. Famously, part of his hatred for the Nazis was the way they had perverted this tradition that he loved so much. And there's a situation where, yes, we need to defeat Germany, and we certainly need to defeat this madman and his weird Nazi ideology. But we don't need to hate the German people. We don't need to hate the rich culture that has given us so much, literature, music, and art. And this I think is something that he felt it at a very personal level, but also philosophically. And World War One's a good example of this. It must have been very strange to be a soldier age soldier in World War. Well, let me say World War Two, because part of the story of World War Two is that it might not have happened if only the people after the Treaty of Versailles had behaved differently, right? That it's one of the reasons we get the post-war Marshall Plan and the rebuilding of Germany, and of course the Cold War becomes all part of this as well. But the idea was, if only Germany hadn't been quite so humiliated, they wouldn't have given rise to this, right-wing populist movement that becomes the Nazis. And what happens in the late 40s in Europe and also in the Pacific is an attempt to rehabilitate the image of the Germans, and indeed the image of the Japanese too, as, okay, we've been demonizing them. I mean, literally, the language being used is often demonizing or dehumanizing, referring to Germans as swine, as maggots. All of this is documented by people writing about the war. But now we need to see them as good people that we need to help. In fact, we need to give lots of taxpayer money to help them. And I quote this in one of the things. I don't know if I quoted in the Orc book or in the earlier piece, but there's one of the guys quoted in the book, The Good War, was talking about the first time he realized he couldn't quite trust his government was after that he fought in the Korean War. And he said that during World War II, the entire time American propaganda was setting up the Chinese as the greatest people, the ancient culture. We've got to save them from the Japanese imperialism and
Right.
all the horrors of Manchuria and all of that. And it changed on a dime. As soon as the Korean War started, who are we fighting? The Chinese, and we've got to defeat them. And they're this mass enemy that needs to be destroyed. And the guy being quoted in the book is saying, like, for 5 years we were told that the Chinese were our greatest allies and the best people in the world, and we had to save them from the Japanese. And now you're telling me we absolutely have to destroy them in the Korean War. And he's like, but he thought that, he's an intellectual. He's a guy who went on to become a writer. I imagine a lot of people are like, oh, okay, now we're fighting them. And this is, of course, what Orwell talks about in 1984, which, of course, comes out in 1949, right in
Yeah.
the time I'm talking about, where he says, the propagandists for the government will say, we are allies with Eurasia. We are fighting East Asia. And then several times in the book, I think it switches. We have always been allies with East Asia. We have always been at war with Eurasia. And he's getting at that very thing that, the governments are absolutely going to tell you, no, 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 that wasn't that. You're misremembering. We don't hate those guys. We love those guys. We're going to help those guys against these others. And I think Tolkien, of course, was already seeing that. And I'm not saying that he wants us to view orcs in that light, but I think by noting that the enemy itself is going to be dehumanized, we should have more value of the humanity of our enemies. Even, and again, I underline this, I'm not saying he's a pacifist or anti-war. Even if we must defeat them, even if we must fight them and therefore kill many of them, it doesn't mean that they're themselves evil people. And presumably, many of the German soldiers and the Japanese soldiers and the Italian soldiers who survived and were alive in 1950 weren't any more evil than they were in 1942.
Yeah.
They might have been evil. I mean, many of them probably were orcish people who are rough. But that also gets us to the banality of evil, the famous Hannah Arendt argument that so many of these people did horrifying things, but they loved their wives. They kissed their children goodnight. They listened to Mozart. They read poetry. Like, these aren't monsters, even if they were they were doing monstrous things. And that's a cautionary tale for all of us. Like, because we're all capable of being the ones who, in retrospect, could be called the orcs, right? But at the time, we thought we were doing the right thing. One of my other authors that I've written a book about is Kurt Vonnegut. And Vonnegut, of course, shares this issue because he's a World War II veteran himself, and obviously wrote his most famous novel, Slaughterhouse Five, in part inspired by his own experiences in the war. But he comes from a German American family. Both of his grandfathers had immigrated to Indiana from Germany. His parents were both very proudly German, and he talks, in fact, about how World War One and the anti-German sentiment really was a personal blow to his family because they were so proud
Mm.
of their German American heritage at a time when, of course, America became very anti-German, understandably. But a lot of people at that time had to change their names from Schmidt to Smith or Mueller to Miller because they didn't want to be associated with the German names that they had previously been proud of. And that's something that Vonnegut, said was really weighing on them. And then he mentions this in his introduction to his novel Mother Night. He said, if I had been born in Germany, I probably would have been fighting with the Nazis too. Like, what else was a 19-year-old German kid going to do? Right? He was
Right.
going to be in the army. And his point is, I wasn't more moral because I happened to be born in America, and therefore, you know, all of these people probably think they're doing the right thing, or at least if they are doing evil, they're doing it in the service of a greater good. And so many of us, whether we're delusional, and in some cases we may be delusional, self-delusional, but in many cases we think we're doing the right thing, or at least, like I said, if we know we're doing something bad, we at least can justify it, can rationalize it. And so Vonnegut is, saying like, we shouldn't necessarily be too proud of ourselves for having been on the right side, because we might very well have been doing the same sort of evil things. And that's where the bombing of Dresden comes in for Vonnegut, because in his
Mm.
view, yes, the good guys perpetrated this, and yes, there are arguments to suggest that it was a reasonable thing to do, but they still were bombing civilians and not military targets. They still killed tens of thousands of people, who were otherwise not likely to be threats to them. And that was the good guys. That was the United States and the British Air Force. And again, he when he says that, he's not like, oh, see, America's really evil, or they're just as bad as the Nazis. He's not saying that at all. He's just saying that we have to recognize the degree to which we're all capable of great evil, as well as feeling like we're doing the right thing at the same time. And for all I know, I mean, part of the problem with the orcs is they are so vile, the ones we meet. But when we meet guys like Gorbag and Shagrat, the ones who actually talk to one another, and we overhear orcs talking, they seem to be wanting to do what, in their view at least, is the right thing. Ugluk and Grishnak strike me as very loyal soldiers, very loyal captains, people who are great leaders and of their own, groups, having therefore admirable qualities. I mean, qualities we would find as admirable. Now, again, they might not be living up to those. Shippey mentions this in his book, the Road to Middle Earth, that when when Gorbag and Shagrat are talking, they mention that leaving a friend behind to die is a horrible thing to do. They think that the character that is Sam, but they don't know who it is, has left his poor friend behind, and they call it a regular elvish trick. They're using elvish exactly in the way that the elves or the humans might use the word orcish.
Yeah.
They've just turned it around. But what Shippey points out is they're not they're not embracing what the good guys would call evil. They're embracing the same things that the good guys would call good: loyalty, faithfulness to your friend, telling the truth. These are the things that they're embracing. So it's not, Satan in Milton's Paradise Lost actually says, "Evil be now my good." He's turning the values around. They don't do that. What they think is good is the same thing we think is good. The difference, of course, as Shippey points out very quickly, is they don't really live up to their ideals. And within a few pages, they're already, tricking each other, doing regular elvish tricks to one another. And so that's true too. But as I would point out, and I hope I'm not sounding too misanthropic when I say this, their lack of living up to their ideals and their crudeness and their coarseness, and indeed at times their cruelty, strikes me as every bit as human as anything they do, because humans are people who do crude and coarse and cruel things to one another. That strikes me as not a sign of their inhumanity, but a sign of, I use the Nietzsche phrase, all too human. you, know? That's a sign of just how human they really are.
Yeah. Oh man. Oh man. This has just been fun, and I loved the book. And I think people who enjoy orc aesthetics or just want to learn more about Tolkien, I think the book would just be a treat for anybody who is interested in that sort of thing. But wrapping up here, Rob, is there anything, and let's say, I'll have links to the book in the show notes. So if anyone picks up your book or decides to check out Mythlore and your work, like what are some things you want people to really stew on when it comes to wrestling with orcs, or maybe even just Tolkien stuff in general?
Well, there are a couple of things that, for the book especially, that I wanted to make clear, and I hope I am making clear that, by expressing my orc sympathies, right, and by being an orc sympathizer, I certainly am not trying to say the orcs are the good guys in Lord of the Rings. I wish Sauron won, or anything like that. I'm not saying that. And I'm certainly not saying that Tolkien is suggesting that might be a good way to think. And I'm also, I wanted to make this clear. I mean, people might be surprised at just how much of my book is quoting Tolkien,
Yeah.
or working my way through Tolkien's text. If I'm not quoting him, at least describing the scenes. It's because I wanted to show not just that Rob Talley, likes orcs and therefore I'm giving you my orc interpretation, but that Tolkien himself is giving us all this information. He's showing, everything I say about orcs is either coming from Tolkien's own words or from suggestions or consequences of what he's showing us in the text. Therefore, of course, the last thing I would want to do is just say, "Oh no, you're misreading it. Orcs are really the good guys." It's nothing like that. It's that Tolkien himself gives us enough room to imagine orcs not as good guys. I never suggest they are good guys, but as humans and as people who have sort of reasonable, rational human desires, expectations. The desire, for example, not to have your front porch invaded by strangers, even if they are seeking shelter from a storm. Um, One of the things in The Hobbit that's interesting is that the great goblin scene interrogating Thorin is almost identical in even the language to the Elven King's interview with Thorin as well, where he's like, "What were you doing trespassing on our lands?" And he's like, "We weren't trespassing. We were coming to beg for food." But I mean, it's literally like a repeat of the scene, and that can't be accidental. It's
Mm.
at that point, at least from the Dwarf's perspective, the goblins and the elves are equally dangerous, not necessarily equally evil, of course, but they're obstacles. And one could easily imagine, given that the elves and dwarves had been at war with one another before, and that's part of the bad blood between Thorin and Elven King. Um, is that in another version of the Hobbit, maybe the dwarves are the bad guys, and we're cheering for the three armies that are against them. There's at least something to suggest that. But the main thing is, I do want the takeaway to be not that orcs are good or that we should embrace orcishness in any way, but to recognize that what we're talking about is a kind of dehumanization of an enemy that is in fact human, and that we in our I don't want to turn this into a preachy book or anything. It's really about the way in which orcs are presented in Tolkien and how they could be read as humane but bad guy creatures in Tolkien. But Tolkien, there is another letter that I quote from that I think is relevant to this, especially in our world where we are seeing so many, so much violence and so much tyranny and whatnot. One of this is in the letters, and one of somebody had written to him like, how would God even permit something like orcs to come into being? And Tolkien's answer is very worldly. It's not metaphysical at all. He says, I see no more sort of contradiction with that than the idea that God tolerates the dehumanization of people by tyrants today. In other words, the orcs aren't just creatures, twisted elves or men twisted by the satanic forces, but it's the same way that again the German government was sort of making life less humane for their own people, or again tyrants around the world mistreating their own people, certainly mistreating certain select groups that have been made into scapegoats or out groups. And for Tolkien to say that, referring to orcs in that way, suggests to me that he already knew, despite what's happening in the books, that yeah, orcs aren't inherently evil, and therefore deserve some sympathy. I keep wanting to repeat. I'm not saying cheer for the orcs. I know I earlier said I have a chapter called an essay called "Let Us Now Praise Famous Orcs," but I'm really again just saying that be careful about anything, including stories that make you want to dehumanize your fellow man. I guess that would be my preachy point.
I
And I
love
think
it.
that's Tolkien's as well. I think
Mm.
Tolkien's concern about Sauronism, if I can call it that, is that he will do that to the so-called free peoples of Middle Earth, that he is dehumanizing people wherever he goes, and that's the danger. The notion that men could be turned into orcs that way is I think a warning that he would stand by. So yeah.
Yeah. Oh man, so good, so good. Rob, where can people find you online? And then, of course, I'll link the book. But is there any other books or projects that you want people to be, pointed towards?
Well, I wish I had a better online presence. I used to have a website, and then I let it lapse without paying for the server fees, and then somebody else took it. So for the love of God, don't go to that, because it's something else now. It's like owned by some company in the South Pacific to advertise probably, bootleg goods or something. Apparently, this is something an orcish behavior that I've learned about in the internet age, is that people just buy up domain names and then use them.
Oh
Uh,
yeah.
um, so I'm very disappointed that I let go of that. The university site, when you Google me, it comes up. That's the official thing now. I really probably ought to make a web page that's better. But a list of my books are on Amazon and places like that. I don't. I do have Twitter. Robert Talley is I think my Twitter. I have Blue Sky too. That is probably also Robert Talley. You can find me on social media. I do have other books coming out, but it's not really Tolkien related, so I don't know if our fandom really needs to see it. It's a book on cosmopolitan theory, which I suppose is related in the sense of still wanting not to dehumanize people from around the world, but it's not, doesn't mention Tolkien.
Well, I've got a bunch of people who are also listeners who enjoy critical theory and things like that. So if you like critical theory, listeners, you should definitely check out Rob, because he doesn't just do literature. He does, like I said, cosmopolitan stuff. I mean, you do political theory too, correct?
Yeah, well, it's sort of, yeah. I mean, I'm a literary critic, so it's
Yeah.
really, it's Marxism and whatnot, but really very much in a sort of cultural theory way. I can give a plug out to a book that literally just came out like this week, which is a book I've co-edited called "The Future of Totality: Frederick Jameson and the Prospects of Critical Theory." And Frederick Jameson was, as I said, a former teacher of mine, a well-known Marxist cultural critic who died at age 90 in 2024. And we had originally put that project together as a way of celebrating his 90th birthday, but then he died later that year. So it
Mm,
carries somewhat, well, slightly elegiac tone in the sense of mourning his loss, but it's also very future looking, like how we can take Jameson's ideas and move into new directions. And that book is an edited collection of essays with 19 awesome contributors, some of the best people working in cultural theory today and literary studies. But also, some of your readers may, if they also do sci-fi, may know Kim Stanley Robinson, the great American sci-fi author, probably most famous for his Red Mars trilogy, um, as well as he had a book a few years ago that was a bestseller called The Ministry of the Future, sci-fi work. But his name is Kim Stanley Robinson, and he had been a student of Jameson's way back in the early 70s at UC San Diego. And he writes a foreword for our book that's sort of remembering Jameson as a teacher. It's very cool. But also Jameson actually encouraging him to write sci-fi rather than do cultural theory. Like, you can do more good writing your novels. But they had a lifelong friendship ever since he was like an undergrad, and so he has this very moving, touching forward to the book, remembering his time with him. So if you're interested in that kind of critical theory, the kind of work Jameson did, and the field in general, I am plugging that book, which just came out from Duke University Press, like literally this week, June 26th, I think it came out.
awesome, man. Well, everyone, go find Rob. Go find his books. the mismeasure of orcs and all that stuff. But thanks for doing this, Rob. This has been super fun.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And great job with the podcast. I love it.
Thanks, man.